Welcome to Dialogue, a true crime conversation. I'm your host, Rebecca Sebastian, and we are in week 2 of our series on women. Every week for this series, I'm going to be talking to a female guest, and we're going to talk about female-centric themes and ideas. Last week, we explored a notable woman of history, and this week, I am talking to a notable woman of history. I am talking to the incredible Jerri Williams.
I knew FBI agents, from TV and movies and books. Even back then I was reading, lots of crime fiction. But even in my mind, I thought of an FBI agent as a white male in a dark suit, all kind of reserved. It never crossed my mind.
Jerri Williams is a retired FBI agent, and she is on a mission in retirement to share with you and communicate what the FBI does and who they are. And she does this through her books. There are many. I will link to them in the show notes. Her blog and her podcast, which is called FBI Retired Case File Review. It's basically an interview format show just like mine, where she talks to other former retired FBI agents. So if you are curious about the FBI, you are going to love this episode, and you're going to hear some common myths. She's going to debunk those, and her regard and passion for the FBI is so evident in everything she says and in all of her work. But she is also not afraid to face and confront the issues that law enforcement is facing right now. And we have a very candid conversation about police reform, what that means, and we also learn about her career. I mean, she was one of very few women in the FBI when she joined in 1982, and one of even fewer Black women. So there is so much to be learned from Jerri. I'm just so excited for you to hear this conversation. It's everything I hoped it would be and more. I will link to all of her wonderful work in the show notes. It was just my honor to speak with her. So please enjoy this conversation. And Jerri, thank you so much for killing the small talk. Well, I'm delighted to welcome you, Jerri, to Dialogue Podcast. Thank you so much for joining me tonight.
Thank you for having me. This is going to be fun. I know it.
Oh, yeah, I feel that too. I'm so excited. You are a prolific storyteller. Truly, you write books, you podcast, and it all stems from your notable career in the FBI. So I would love to hear your story. I think everyone's path there is a little different, but it certainly is. It always impresses me when anybody makes it in and then, tells the stories. So tell us how you came to become an agent.
It really was not your typical origin story. A lot of people talk about how when they became an agent, they had wanted to be an FBI agent since they were a child. They had watched a TV show or a movie, or they knew somebody that was an agent, and that was their path. They always wanted to be an agent, but that was not my path at all.
Interesting.
I was a juvenile probation officer in Newport News, Virginia, and I loved the job. But one day I saw a newsletter that said that the FBI was looking for women and minorities, and this was back in 1982, so
wow.
long time ago. And before that, I can tell you I had never even thought about being an FBI agent. I knew FBI agents, from TV and movies and books. Even back then I was reading, lots of crime fiction. But even in my mind, I thought of an FBI agent as a white male in a dark suit, all kind of reserved. It never crossed my mind. It never crossed my mind. Now, my roommate in college, who is my best friend still today, was a police officer in Baltimore. So when I saw this newsletter that was saying that they were looking for women and minorities, it was something that I could look at and, seriously consider, maybe I could look into this. And when I called the office, the agent that answered the phone was wonderful. I mean, he really recruited me. Wow. We talked for about 45 minutes, and I still have my notes from our conversation to this day. And next thing I know, 6 months later, I was walking into the FBI Academy for training, thinking to myself, what have I done?
Oh my gosh, that's wild. So a couple things. You were a law enforcement officer. So did you always know that? Did you always know you wanted to go in that direction?
No, I actually was a psychology major in college. And the job that I had as a juvenile probation officer, the title was called aftercare counselor, because I got the kids that were sent away to reform school and group homes. And then when they came back to the community, I'd work with their parents and the schools to reintroduce them into the community.
Well,
And so it was really my interest in psychology that got me into juvenile probation.
that's really interesting, and what a needed role. I would imagine that's pretty draining work. Or
It
did you
was,
love it? Or was
I loved it, and it was absolutely so stressful.
yeah.
I mean, I did it for 3 years, and one of the reasons I was looking around and open to other opportunities is in 3 years, I had burned myself out. Now, I
Mm-hmm.
got this job when I was 22. So yeah, I was a child myself.
Yeah.
And my kids, the kids I had on my caseload were getting into fights. They were robbing houses, and the girls, almost all of the girls, were in juvenile prostitutes,
Oh
work,
man.
sex workers. And so I really wanted to get them on the straight and narrow path. But these are kids that had already been in so much trouble that they had been taken out of their home. And
Yeah.
so I had like, uh, and this is in the terms of their activity, not in terms of the kids themselves, but I had the
Sure.
worst of the worst.
Yes.
You know, I had the kids where it just was to a point where, a judge said, that's it. You know, we're pulling you out of the house, and we're sending you away to get rehabilitated. But most of the time it didn't work because they were coming back home, to the same friends, to the same family life that they had left in the first place. So yeah, after 3 years, I I was so burned out. I cared so much. I was so involved, with these kids, that if there's other opportunities, I'll take it. If not, I'll stay here.
Yeah.
But I was open to the possibility of doing something else. It's a hard job.
It sounds like a hard job. I imagine there is a high burnout rate, and I also think at the age you were, you probably weren't great at boundaries. I mean, like a new worker in any role, you're so eager to perform, and you seem like someone who works really hard. And so I'm sure it was hard to set boundaries and not get fully invested, which then doesn't become sustainable.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the older, and there were people there who had been doing it, all their adult lives,
Yeah.
and I would look at them and I would say, how come you don't care more? How come you're
Yeah.
not doing more? I was really kind of criticizing the distance and the like you said, boundaries that they had with the kids. But, now I can look back and see why it was that way. Many of them had been doing the job for so long that they had had the parents of the kids on their caseload.
Wow. So
Yeah.
how did you talk about this with your FBI interviewers, and you're going through the system? How do you parlay that experience into what they're looking for, and what were they looking for?
Well, I guess, they're looking for somebody who is very self-confident, who can walk into a situation and look around, make an assessment, and realize that they can figure it out.
Okay.
They may not be able to walk in and say, "Oh, I got this," but they know that whatever is going on, they'll be able to figure it out. They'll be able to handle it either by asking for help, admitting that they're not sure what's going on, and seeking additional resources, but having the confidence that with those extra things that they're going to be looking at, they'll be able to handle whatever is put in front of them. And I think that I was able to show that from the work that I had done as a juvenile probation officer. I mean, again, I had a lot of responsibility. I was traveling all over the state of Virginia to these different group homes and reform schools
Oh, wow.
to meet with the kids. A lot of times I was driving their parents who didn't have the transportation to even visit their children. And so I took them with me. And so, at 22, there were many ways that I was parenting the parents. like trying to encourage them to come with me to go see their kids who hadn't seen them for, months.
Yeah, and anyone who has a teenager or knows one knows, in any and all circumstances, teenagers are a tough audience, right? So all in, it was 6 months of interviews and background checks. Talk about that whole process.
Yeah, and I think that's why the FBI is, the standards are pretty tough.
Yeah,
They're tough when you're trying to get in because of the background investigation and all that they do. I mean, they really take that time. For me, it was 6 months, but really, it the average time period is at least a
wow.
year. Yeah, of just going through the interview phase, the testing phase, the physical fitness, the physical examination, because they want to
Yeah,
make sure you're healthy, the polygraph examination. They actually talk to your neighbors, they talk to your employer when especially if it's your current employer. They may wait until they're ready to, that's the last thing they do, but they're talking to everybody. They're doing a full security background, and that way, they have an idea of, it's not 100% foolproof, but they have
sure.
an idea of who they're hiring. And one of the most important things for them is to assess your current job,
Okay,
because the best predictor of future behavior is what you're doing presently.
makes
And
sense.
so they want to hear what people, think about you. And it's very, very important. And those standards don't change, once you become an FBI agent.
So during that time, by the time they come around to you with their decision, did you want it more at this point? Was it like building up to where, you'd gone in a little bit casually, but at this point, are you pretty excited to get it?
Yeah, especially when I found out, this is funny, but two of the probation officers, older men that I worked with, they had also applied at some point and had been turned down, had not been
Oh,
able to get in. And so when they heard that I was interested, oh, they were so discouraging. Oh, there's no way you're getting in, and it's very tough, and the standards are too high, and I was rejected. And so I think a lot of it had to do with that.
proving
I
them
had to,
wrong.
yeah, I'm very competitive. It's probably one of my faults that, I'm competitive. And the worst thing about it is that at the time, my roommate was another female probation officer. 3 or 4 years later, she also became an agent. So,
Oh
and that,
man, double
yeah,
whammy.
so so two of us from the Newport News probation office ended up becoming FBI agents. And also, remember my roommate from college who I said was a police officer in
Yeah,
Baltimore? She
yeah.
became an FBI agent too.
My
So I
gosh, what are
came
the
in.
chances?
I came in and I brought two of my friends and roommates with me. So
That is really,
yeah.
really cool. And I didn't expect what you were going to say about the two older gentlemen at your office, or men. I don't know if they don't sound like gentlemen. I thought you were going to say they heard and were encouraging you and saying, go get it for us, like, do it for us, Jerri. But that's so disappointing and not all that
Yeah.
surprising, I guess.
Yeah,
Um,
no, it's not surprising at all.
yeah,
But yeah,
yeah.
like you said, it was probably a motivator for me.
So they offer you an assignment. And am I right in remembering that you don't get to choose?
That is absolutely correct. And one of the
Okay.
things that they keep stressing when you're applying for the FBI position is that you must be willing to be transferred anywhere in the United States,
Wow.
anywhere in the
Wow.
United States.
Were you born and raised on the East Coast?
I actually am an Air Force brat. So
Okay.
my father was in the Air Force, and I mean, we traveled all the time. We were in Morocco and France and Germany and England and Massachusetts,
Oh,
Maine, Washington State and Spokane. And then my father settled at Langley Air Force Base in Virginia, and that's how I happened to be there for my last couple of years of high school.
okay. So you've got some experience in adapting to new environments.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
I am so used to being the only one,
Right.
many times being the only, little black girl,
Yeah.
growing up and moving. And so it was kind of easy for me because again, I was used to being the only one. So that was not an issue.
So what were the issues? What was the most daunting thing about that new role? And tell us exactly where you got assigned into what department.
Okay. I worked bank robberies and applicant matters.
Okay.
When I went to Sacramento, I was assigned to work a government fraud case,
Whoa.
which I'm telling you, white collar crime is a lot more complicated and complex investigation than, say, a bank robbery or any type of violent crime or reactive crime, because there's so many aspects to it. And in some white collar crime cases, you're not even sure if what you're looking at is a crime. Is it a civil misunderstanding,
Oh.
a contract issue? So it depends on what the case is, but working government fraud as a new agent was very challenging for me. I didn't really know what I was doing. I had a training agent, but he wasn't that interested in training me. So
Yeah.
yeah. So, but my first assignment was a fraud type of a squad, and later that became my specialty, economic crime and fraud, and I grew to really love it.
When you started to get your footing in that role, what did you quickly learn is the way in? What's your starting point?
The starting point in most of those cases is a good witness victim interview.
Okay.
Really getting an understanding of what the allegation is and all the elements of what happened. So I ended up specializing in Ponzi schemes and
Mm.
advance fee schemes. I had a huge business to business telemarketing case. And so in these situations, it's really the victim interview, the witness interview that gives you the best insight into the case. And
Okay.
then once you know what happened, now you've got to go in and try to gather that type of evidence that's going to prove it. And a lot of it is paper evidence. It's, what's on paper, what was agreed to. If it's overbilling or some type of invoicing, is, getting those records. And so search warrants and records review were also very important in those type of investigations.
So there's more about white collar crime in the true crime space recently. I think, and I always appreciate those stories because every now and then it's nice to not think about murder or watch a murder and a case. So nonviolent crime can be refreshing in a way. Not that it isn't victimless, because I know there are victims in it, but obviously it seems like there's greed as a motivator. But what else do you see as a motivator with these kinds of criminals, these con men and schemers and scammers?
Yeah, it's the same type of greed that a person who may be selling drugs or being involved in some type of violent crime in order to steal or take something from them. The greed is definitely the most important motivator, and it's probably even stronger than any other type of violation. I mean, it's an interest in getting money, getting something of value based on your wits that is, I guess, intoxicating and addicting for the people that are involved. I mean, because a lot of times when you look at some of the victims, like anybody that would scam or con somebody out of their life savings, an elderly person out of their life savings, I mean, what do you have to say to yourself to
Right.
be able to make that okay?
Right.
To
Yeah.
me, it's just fascinating.
I think so too. I think everyone could understand greed to an extent. It's a spectrum. We probably all fall on it somewhere. You will do something for money, but what would let you do that? Like everybody has a line. How could they cross that line? So you end up now writing about the myths, and debunking myths is one of your books about the FBI. So I'd love to talk about what the FBI doesn't do and what do we get wrong all the time. Are people disappointed to find out, what FBI agents actually do? Could you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, no, I don't think they get wrong what we do, because the
Okay.
FBI investigates over, well, I'm always saying 200 violations of federal law, but lately I've been hearing 300 violations of federal law. So we're involved in so many things. I mean, whether it's organized crime or drug trafficking, human trafficking,
Yeah.
counterintelligence, terrorism, white collar crime, corruption, cyber crime, you name it. So they don't get that part wrong, but it's really kind of the procedures and the policies working those investigations that they get wrong.
Okay.
Are the different levels. Like I always tell people that the FBI investigates murder, but not a local murder. We have nothing to do with, something that happened down the street. The type of murder cases that we're involved in have a federal nexus. So, for instance, the murder of a federal law enforcement agent,
Right.
the murder of a judge, the murder that might occur during the commission of a bank robbery in a federally insured bank,
Okay.
a murder that occurs on a Indian reservation, a murder that occurs on any type of government land. There has to be some type of federal nexus to that before the FBI gets in. And so sometimes I'm watching a TV show or a movie or reading a book, and the FBI is involved in a murder, and I'm thinking, like, where's the
Why?
jurisdiction? Yeah,
Yeah.
why is the FBI there?
Okay, that makes sense. What about in a case of a potential, if it's a civil rights violation, murders?
A lot of murders that happened in the South that were Ku Klux Klan murders, where people were arrested, or whether they were or weren't, and taken to trial, and they were acquitted.
Mm-hmm.
The FBI has been very successful in going back and
Wow.
looking at those cases, and maybe 30, 40 years later, being able to charge the persons responsible and get them convicted. And
Well,
but
okay.
that would not be necessary until after they see how the local or the state case first, works out.
How do they avoid double jeopardy in the case of these Ku Klux Klan decades later? How do they get around that?
It's a different violation. First, we're not looking at where that those were state murder cases, and the
Okay.
FBI is coming in and looking at a federal civil rights investigation, civil rights
I
violation.
see. Okay, so the
Yeah.
charge is different.
I've got one really great episode on my podcast that was just so inspiring, and sometimes when I'm listening to these cases that I don't even know about,
Yeah.
it just makes you feel so great about the FBI. And it was one of those cases that it was an old Klan case where an older Black man, he had been murdered by two Klansmen, and years later they found out that where the body was discovered, that he had been killed in that spot, and it was federal property, that it was federal land. And so the agent that I'm talking to was able to go back and do his investigation, interview people that had been too afraid to speak during the state investigation, and actually get charges and get a conviction for this man. For one of the men, one of them had already died, but for one of the people that had killed, his name was Ben Chester White. And
Oh,
again,
that's
listening to
remarkable.
the agent talk about this case, it was just so inspiring, just
Yeah.
to see the work that he did, and the fact that a lot of times agents find cases. You, of course, you're given some assignments, but you may speak to an attorney or a victim or the U.S. Attorney's Office. Someone tells you about a case, and you can go to your supervisor and say, hey, look, I got this case, I got this allegation, and I'd like to run with it. And that's what
Oh,
this agent did. And again, it was just a wonderful feeling to see him spend this time on this case that everybody else had forgotten all about.
I was just thinking that, that it's so easy for these things with time passing just to be forgotten. And the fact that somebody goes looking and seeking justice so many years later, anytime that happens, and especially when it has an ending like that, it's just
Yeah.
so powerful. So, your podcast, let's talk about that a little bit. When did you decide, I assume after retirement, when you were able to become a storyteller, to kind of lift the veil to the FBI? What inspired that?
Well, the last 5 years of my FBI career, I actually was the spokesperson for the Philadelphia office. And so, in many offices, they'll have an agent who is the person who talks to the media.
Okay.
They're the person that, answers the questions if there can be, any communication about an ongoing case, or just kind of talks to the media, talks to newspaper, talk to TV people. And so it was a wonderful job. And then when I left the FBI, I took that same kind of role as a spokesperson, director of media relations for SEPTA, the train line. Wherever you are, if there's a train, and in Philadelphia, it's the trains, the buses, the trolleys, and the subways.
Oh,
So
wow.
it's one agency that handles everything.
Okay.
And so I was their spokesperson. I did that for 7 years. And during that time, before I left the FBI, I had started writing my first crime novel. And one of the things I wanted you to do was to start building your platform. How are you going to introduce potential readers to you and your books? And I just decided that I would become a podcaster because I was listening to podcasts at the time.
So smart.
Yeah.
And you were ahead of the curve too. I know they existed. It wasn't like the first day of podcasting, but you beat a lot of people what it is now.
So I actually launched my podcast in January of 2016. And and the book didn't come out until September of 2016, but we all know what happened in the fall of 2016.
Yeah, things there were some diversions, I would imagine, for people's attention.
Yes, absolutely. And their perception of the FBI.
Right.
I mean, there were some people who, were, still very, supportive of the FBI, and there were some people who did not like the FBI. And so it became a very important time for people who wanted the truth to kind of look at who the FBI is and what the FBI does. And I had a podcast.
Right.
So,
you're like, I can help with this.
Yes. Yeah. So
can you answer that? Like, who is the FBI when someone asks in that way? That's such an interesting question to even put a persona around it. But what is the essence of the FBI from your well-positioned perspective?
Well, and I think from the very beginning, the FBI was a federal law enforcement agency that worked to focus on a national level at major crimes. After 9/11, that changed, and it became, it was still a law enforcement agency, but the motivation was not just to investigate crimes after they had occurred, but the onus was put on the FBI to prevent crimes before they occurred.
Yeah.
And so the FBI became almost immediately an intelligence-driven organization, where now we're looking and out and trying to gather as much information. I remember feeling the change, watching the change, noticing the change, because I didn't retire until 7 years later. But I could see how the FBI was morphing into this intelligence-driven organization, and how many of the agents were being directed to trying to, again, stop the next attack. Wow. And it was the FBI was always a very competitive and disciplined organization. Yeah. I mean, people don't understand the so many rules and policies and guidelines and things that we do that a lot of other organizations are a lot more relaxed with. And it was really the commitment to protecting the country was just so strong at the time. And a lot of the things that we normally did as a law enforcement agency, that a lot of that time, energy, resources, and manpower were now changed over to, the terrorism area.
Sure. And so where's the intersection? Because the FBI is so domestically focused, and a lot of the terrorism, especially at that time, would be international. How do you work that out with, say, other agencies who are more global and international in terms of presence? Like,
the FBI is very, very international and global.
Okay.
We have offices. Yeah, we have, I think there's 63 offices in countries throughout the world.
Wow. Okay.
Now many times, we don't have jurisdiction to actually, carry our guns and walk into somebody's house and interview them in a foreign country. We have to work with their law enforcement agencies, with their security personnel in order to get that done. But those relationships have been established. They know who we are. And so if something needs to be done, it's just a matter of those agents in those countries working with their foreign counterparts to get the answers to those questions that we have. And of course, we have what is called extraterritorial jurisdiction.
Ooh.
And if something happens to an American citizen that has some type of terrorism nexus, but it occurs overseas, say there's a bombing, a terrorist bombing in Bali.
Yeah.
Then the FBI has the authority to go to Bali to work with the law enforcement agencies in Bali to gather the evidence so that if the perpetrator, the bad guy, is found in Bali, we can bring him back to the United States and try him here for the death of the American citizens in that terrorist bombing. And so we are definitely very global. I think a lot of times people think about the CIA, as the international agency, but they're strictly a intelligence agency.
Okay.
They have no law enforcement abilities or capabilities. That's all the FBI. So the FBI is the primary law enforcement agency for the United States.
That's good to know. Yeah, I definitely saw those as almost competitive agencies, but it sounds like not at all between the CIA and the FBI. Is there a weird internal competition, though, amongst you guys?
Oh, absolutely. And they say, that there is some blame there for 9/11 because if you've ever watched the movie or read the book, The Looming Tower, they talk about the fact that there were things that the CIA knew that some of the people on the FBI watch list that they had come into the United States that were not shared with us. And so, things have changed a lot.
Yeah. Wow. That is really interesting. Now, what about on a cultural sort of internal level? From the time you entered, it would have been what, mid 80s?
Yeah, I came into the FBI in 1982.
Yeah, so early 80s. Was encouraged to hear they're recruiting females of color, right? So that seems progressive already. But I can't imagine it's an actually progressive environment. From the time you entered to leaving, were there other shifts within the agency and specifically your offices where you were? But for women and people of color, did things change over the years?
The FBI has always put an effort, I believe, to get more women and minorities in the FBI.
That's wonderful.
When I came in, there was less than 0.5% of the of the people in the FBI were Black females. So I could tell you I was number 23. I know for a fact. I have the EEO statistics from a few months after I got in. And so I know I was number 23. So at that time, there was about 8,000 or 9,000 FBI agents and 23 of them were Black female. But less than, I think it was 482, again, from that EEO statistics that I have, women. Yeah. So in a room of 100 agents at that time when I came in, 5 or 6 of the people in the room would have been women and a half a person would have been a Black female.
Gosh.
But unfortunately, a lot hasn't changed. Even today, only 1%. Now there's about 13,000 agents and still 1% are Black females. But women went from about 5 or 6% to right now it's about 20%. Yeah. So now if you're in a room of 100 agents, 20 of them could be women. So the recruitment of women to the FBI has increased. Of course, I'd like that to be 50%. But
honestly,
right now it's about, less than 4% of all FBI agents are Black. Around maybe 4% are Asian, 4% are Hispanic, Latino. So it's still pretty low, it's still pretty low.
So if the recruitment seems healthy, then what do you attribute the lack of retention or ability to build that base?
Yeah. And it's not retention because, the
They're
FBI
not.
has one of the best retention rates.
Okay.
I mean, once somebody becomes an FBI agent, I mean, the attrition rate is extremely low. Most
Good.
people stay for the full at least 20 years until they can retire. So it's not necessarily retention, but there is an issue with just the recruitment. And I do think the FBI is attempting to do a great job. I've seen some wonderful ads and commercials, but they've got to do more.
Yeah.
And I think the biggest way is to get more people that are actually agents to do one-on-one recruitment. When they see, someone that they feel that could be an agent, even somebody that's a young child, a young adult, helping them and putting that bug in their ear.
Yeah.
Because I think for all, and this has been said so many times, and you can't say it enough, that all law enforcement agencies, whether they're federal, FBI, or your local or state law enforcement agencies, must reflect the community for which they serve. They have to. And the reason that I think that there is so many issues and questions and the need for reform is that there are not enough minorities in these agencies. The community doesn't feel they're being served.
Yeah.
And,
no,
that's
it's worth saying again. I'm really glad to hear you say that. I certainly wanted to hear your take on police reform, and I know it relates more to local law enforcement in our country. The conversations happening right now are on the department level in states, towns, and cities, not so much the FBI. But I would welcome your thoughts on it in terms of, what you see as a way forward, and I think you're putting a really important one forward. I'm in New York City, so I feel like our NYPD, from where I stand and see as a citizen, it does reflect our city. It is diverse. But when I look at the numbers, it is surprisingly, if you look at the entire 5 boroughs, it's still probably I don't want to actually misquote it, but it's lower than you would expect in terms of minority officers. But it's probably better here than in other places.
Right. And I guess it's almost like a revolving problem.
Yeah.
That the community looks at law enforcement, local, state, law enforcement, and they don't see themselves on the force. But when it comes to recruitment, because there's such a disconnect, then there's a difficulty in getting more minorities to join. So
Sure.
It's such a serious problem.
I know.
It is such a serious issue. And yeah, I do believe that, in police reform, and I can't understand how anyone couldn't. When you have communities that are in the street saying, we don't feel that we're being served, we don't feel protected, there is no question that reform is necessary.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't look at that and say, we don't need reform, because don't you want to be able to serve the community that you're in?
Yeah.
Don't you want them to feel that you're there for them? And I just know, as a Black woman, who has a Black son, and I felt it quite necessary to give him, we've all heard about the talk.
Mm-hmm.
When he was a kid, he and his friends, and of course, I lived in the suburbs. I don't live in the suburbs now. I live in a very diverse community now, but for 20-some years, I lived in South Jersey, right outside of Philadelphia, in a very, kind of upper middle class, suburban, mostly white area. And so most of my son's friends were white, and they used to play, with BB guns out in the woods. And it got to a point where I took the gun and hit it. I still have it. Matter of fact, it's in my closet over here.
He'll never know.
Because, and he was so angry with me. And I said, you can't, when you're on your way home from playing BB guns in the woods. And of course, the guns looked exactly like real guns.
Yeah.
You're on your way home. If you were stopped, it's going to be totally different than this is just reality, people. If there's somebody listening who cannot get this, who does not believe this is true, this is reality. And as somebody who carried a weapon every single day of their career, I knew that I could not let my son, once he got to 14 or 15, be able to have this BB gun anymore, I just couldn't. And so I took it and I hid it and I refused to give it back to him.
And I imagine that opened an uncomfortable door to the reality of white privilege, that he could see his friends exercising freely and, just a tangible reminder of something he could not do. This episode of Dialogue is presented by Away Travel. Remember travel? I think it's going to come back soon. Quite simply, Away makes everything you need for trips away. Away started with the perfect suitcase. I know, I have one and I love it. Then they built from there, creating a range of travel standards developed from the travel stories of friends and seatmates. The pieces aren't smart, they're thoughtful, with features that solve real travel problems. And to give the whole world access to better travel standards, Away took the direct-to-consumer approach to lower their prices, and their quality is guaranteed. Your Away suitcase will be with you for life. We're teaming up with Away and Podgo to give you the best deal on premium luggage by going to podgo.co/away. That's podgo.co/away. podgo.co/away. Away Travel, here to make your journey seamless. But how do you reconcile that tension with being a law enforcement officer, albeit on a federal level, and knowing that reality exists? How do you personally reconcile it, professionally? What do you do with that?
It's such a hard question, but the reality is that anyone who believes that the world can function, that your state, that your city, that your community can function without policing is an idiot.
You said it, I didn't, but I'm going to agree.
Have laws in order for us to live together, and you have to have law enforcement to make sure that people follow those laws.
Yes.
I mean, if someone were to break into my home, the first thing I would do is to dial 911, and I would expect there to be law enforcement here protecting me and trying to find the person who broke into my home. If, somebody, attacked a family member, I would expect law enforcement to be there to investigate. We have to have laws and we have to have law enforcement, but everybody should feel that law enforcement is there for them, to protect them, to serve them.
Yeah.
And that is the issue. I cannot say that I think that we should do away with police. That is this. No. I mean, once you do that, and now your neighbor's selling drugs outside your door, who's going to handle that? Who's going to take care of that?
Right.
But what we do need is reform so that people who are in the community feel that they're being served.
Yeah.
And that is absolutely necessary and it needs to be done. And it should have been done a long time ago. But there are so many events that are happening today that make us, the insurrection, the hateful things that were said and believed. If you can't understand the need for what's happening in the world today, or not the world, here in the United States today, it's a serious issue that we've got to look into.
Yeah.
We've not looked into it. We've looked into it enough. We've got to start making some changes.
Time to activate. Yeah. Yeah. It's complicated. I don't, mean to suggest it's simple, because I know there have been cuts on the NYPD here in New York, and crime did go up. And some are saying it's not that simple and you can't look at the statistics that way. I just know that it's not an easy job, and I think it's going to take a lot of time, but I do think there have to start to be steps of trying different things. And I don't know that there's going to be one solution for every department. So that gets complicated too. It's so geographically based and there's so many factors, but I appreciate you weighing in on that. I want to go back to your career specifically, and I'd like to know a case that really stands out as having a lasting impact on you, for better or for worse. Was it a really tough one or a really great one? In what way? But one case that just you'll never forget, and is a story you like to tell.
I told this recently, and I'm so glad that I thought about it, because it really kind of pertains to what we're talking about right now. I actually, even though I worked economic fraud for most of my career, I like to stress to everyone who's even thinking about being an FBI agent or who's just curious that even if you have a specialty, when you work for the FBI, you could be involved in anything at any time
Oh, wow.
because they feel everybody's trained, everybody has the capability. And so if there's a drug investigation, a drug raid or a search or, organized crime, if they need bodies, then you get pulled into those assignments. And so for a short while before I became the spokesperson, I worked in one of our New Jersey office. The Philadelphia office investigates 3 counties in South Jersey
Mm.
because it's closer to
Yep.
Philadelphia. I actually lived in South Jersey, so
Yeah.
it's closer to Philadelphia than, say, our Newark office. And one of the office handled one of the counties was Camden, and Camden, New Jersey, in the 90s was like the murder capital
A
of.
tough place.
Yeah, oh, it was a tough
Yeah.
place. Lots of drugs and crime and murders. And so if there was a drug investigation, a drug search or a drug arrest, I went. And one of the agents who was working drugs had come to me at one time. I'll try to make this a shorter story because it's going
Or not.
going long.
I'm on the edge of my seat.
One of the agents who was working one of the drug investigations came to me because one of the major drug dealers in Camden was now also flipping houses because there are a lot of abandoned properties in Camden, and he was flipping them and selling them to people in the community. And this kind of reminds me of if you've ever watched The Wire.
Oh, yeah.
Stringer Bell.
Yeah.
Stringer Bell was trying to morph
Great
into a
show.
drug dealer, into
Yes.
a businessman. Oh, it's one of my favorites.
Well, they're
one of my favorites.
entrepreneurial already. I mean, it makes sense.
He had decided that he was still selling drugs, but he was also flipping houses. He was doing a terrible job. And so not only was he doing a very bad job of renovating these houses, but he was selling them to people who could not qualify for a mortgage.
Okay.
But he was having them lie and doing all kind of fraudulent behavior in order for them to get the mortgage.
Oh.
And so, it was a huge scam. And so the agent came to me who was working this drugs and said, look, I don't know anything about fraud. Can we team up together?
Ooh.
And so I actually was able to work a case that, was with drug dealers because I was pulled in to do the fraud aspect of it. And one of the young drug dealers who we were able to get to cooperate with us, the highlight of that case, we had convictions, was able to get to a number of people on fraud and drug charges. But one of the best things about that is this young man who had been a drug dealer. I was able to work with him, and my co-case agent, Jim Smith, was able to work with him. And by the end of the case, which lasted for about two and a half years,
Oh, wow.
Not only was he no longer selling drugs, but he had gotten custody of 2 of the kids. He had taken paternity suits and found out that 2 kids were actually 2 of several kids that he thought was his were actually his. He got custody and moved to Delaware and got a job and was actually attending PTA meetings and being a great parent, and just watching that transition of watching Jay move from one level, being a drug dealer to being a responsible parent was wonderful. And I don't know where he is today. I really wish I could reach out to him and connect with him and see how he's doing today. But it was definitely a highlight. It was such a highlight of my career that when I became the spokesperson for the FBI and I had those media connections, I was able to get the Philadelphia Inquirer to do an article, not using his real name, about his transition.
Yeah.
And so that article is definitely one of my favorite roles also when I became the media coordinator to get that article done about this wonderful case.
Absolutely. I mean, that's a win for everybody, and maybe it was just the opportunity to take one step outside of what he was doing, cooperate with you guys, and he just saw something open up, and to just witness that is really, really cool.
Yeah, and it came full circle. I mean, I don't know if I thought about it at the time, but I'm definitely thinking now that it was a full circle role of me as a juvenile probation
Right.
officer.
Oh my
You
gosh.
know, yeah,
Yeah.
because he was probably 21, around 21 or so when we were started working with him, maybe 20 when we started working with him.
Yeah.
And, I really looked at him and said, you got to get your act together. You have all these baby mamas that you're not, supporting, and so I was the one who encouraged him to, go ahead and get the paternity and to go to court. And once he found the kids that were his, to take full responsibility for them. And yeah,
Yeah.
it's
So you
definitely a
really
full circle.
integrated your past experience there, and that's very, very cool.
Yeah, it is. It's definitely a highlight of my FBI career, and not one that people would normally think about, when they
No.
talk about that,
No, it's
you know.
highly personal, but you're human. Every
Yeah.
FBI agent is, and it's a
Yeah,
human
and
story.
I did also have my Ponzi scheme case. It was a $350 million Ponzi scheme case that
Whoa.
I was really proud of too, because it made it to American Greed, the CNBC
Oh,
show. Yeah.
yeah.
So late at night, if you're, up and you're watching reruns of American Greed, you may see my episode where, you'll be like, oh, I know
Oh,
her,
that is so cool. Not if I'm up
Yeah.
late at night. I'll probably Google it and see if it's on YouTube. What was the $350 million? What was the essence of that scheme?
Yeah. Well, actually, I took that was one of the cases that I took and fictionalized, and it's my second book called Greedy Givers,
Oh,
because I was fascinated by this case, because it was a person in the Christian community who had started out as a fundraiser helping Christian schools and Christian churches and communities raise money. And for some reason, I guess it was the power. I'm not sure if it was the greed, but it was the feeling of power, which is what also comes as the motivation for con men and scammers. But he started getting people to believe that he was this unbelievable fundraiser and that he had resources from an anonymous donor. So he got organizations, huge organizations, and little small nonprofits to provide him with funds that he told them he was going to hold for 6 months and then double. And of course, it worked out at the beginning, because that's what every Ponzi scheme is. The people who come in at the beginning
yeah.
do very well, but at
Yeah.
the end, there is not enough money in the world to sustain a Ponzi scheme. And so at some point, it collapsed, and he was convicted and went to jail for 12 years, for this Ponzi scheme. And I think the reason that I decided to write a crime novel about it is just kind of answer those questions in my mind. I love that book because
Giver.
Greedy Givers, yeah.
Wow,
Uh,
greedy givers.
and again, and some people may not like the implications, but a lot of times, and I'm not saying every time, but a lot of times that somebody falls for a scam or falls for a con is because there's a little bit of greed in there. They're told, if you give me this money, I'll make you even more.
Sure.
That's, yeah. If you invest in this, you're going to have unbelievable, returns on your investment. And a lot of times, anybody looking at it would say, well, this is too good to be true.
Right.
And it is too good to be
If
true.
it sounds that way, it usually is. Yeah.
Right. But that level of greed makes some people give anyway to something that is a scam. And so that's why I called it Greedy Givers.
Oh, that's good. So how many books are there now? How many crime novels have you written?
I have two crime novels.
Okay.
I'm working on the third one, which is, oh God, it's so hard to get this third one done because I've got so much going on now.
Yeah.
But I'm trying that I will be done with that book sometime mid-year. My goal is to get it out this year. But the first one, I love that book too. It's called Pay to Play. And it wasn't my case, but I had two very attractive female agents in the Philadelphia office were working a case involving a corrupt city official who was in charge of compliance for all the entertainment venues, especially strip clubs.
Oh.
And so they began doing this investigation of corruption in the Philadelphia strip club industry. And they would come back and tell me these stories. And so I turned that real FBI case in Philadelphia into my first crime novel. And so it's all about, it is not what you normally would think of as an FBI crime novel. There's, sexual
Yeah.
assault, there's
Oh,
lots of profanity.
yeah,
If you don't
juicy.
like, yeah, if you don't like any of that stuff, then please do not
This
buy.
one's not for you. I don't know. It
Yeah.
sounds pretty compelling.
Yeah,
Oh my
it's dark.
gosh.
It's a dark book, and the third one I'm working on now. But of course, I do have the nonfiction books, the FBI Myths and
Yes.
Misconceptions, a manual for armchair detectives, and the companion book, which I truly love, which is a word search book.
I was just reading about this today. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so my son and I, when my kids were little, I have 3 kids. One of the things I used to do to help them with their vocabulary word was create word search. You
Yeah.
put the vocabulary words inside, the grid, and then you put a lot of other alphabets in there, and they would have to find the vocabulary words, and it just helped them recognize the words and feel good about the words, and study. So I used to do it all the time, and he reminded me about that last November when we were together for Thanksgiving in 2019. And so in 2020, we wrote the book together, and it's got unbelievable FBI words
Oh my
and
gosh.
terms, but it's not at the, it's like I might have a whole section on organized crime, and I have all the organized crime terms and words, maybe one on international trafficking. And so it's like these terms are very intense, complicated FBI terms. So I like to say it's not your grandmother's word search book,
No, it's not.
but she would love it
I
too.
bet. And also coming out in 2020, what a perfect year. Like
Yes.
people's time has opened up. I feel like I've gotten back to puzzles. People are doing puzzles again and crossword puzzles. I just think, I don't know, we're just at home and we can't be on a screen 20 hours a day. And so they're a nice break. So my oldest and I have actually gone back to crossword puzzles. We're kind of doing them together and texting each other. So this is so perfect for especially like a true crime or a citizen detective.
Yes.
So awesome.
Yeah, and it's a very fun book. Matter of fact, that's what I call it. FBI word search puzzles, fun for armchair detectives.
It's
So
perfect.
it's one of my favorites. So I'm always pushing it, because that's the success of that book is also my son's daughter, who is going to be 2 in April. It's her part of her college fund.
Oh, how beautiful. What a worthy
Yeah.
cause. Well, I'll link to it in the show notes. I know we've got a little bit long, but I have a couple more things I just have to ask you. So this is actually coming out in a series in March because I want to talk to women all month for Women's History Month. So I'm curious, is there a woman, a mentor that you had in your life personally, or somebody who you don't know that's been an inspiration to you? Like who's a guiding female in your career?
Oh, and I feel so sad that I have to answer this question negatively,
Oh,
but
shoot.
yeah, as far as the FBI, many of the women that, were in the FBI were my contemporaries, because even though the FBI had women for 10 years, the first women came in 1972, but I didn't have a female in law enforcement as a role model.
Okay.
Definitely people that I worked with that, I respected and admired, but I didn't have anybody that I could kind of look at and say, oh, I want to be like her.
Right.
But I can say that there were a number of men, in the FBI that were, definitely, I will say this, not necessarily the first 4 years.
Were you still proving yourself?
I was still fighting and trying to prove myself and get someone to believe that I belonged there. But, after that point, I think there were a number of men that I worked with and that, supervised me that really helped me, with my career. I would hope, and I'd be so sad that one of the saddest things that I would feel about my career is if you ask that question to people that came after me and they weren't able to say, Jerri helped me, because I really believe and hope that I helped to guide the women who came after me and be a mentor and a role model for them. It was definitely something that I aggressively
Oh, wow.
wanted to do. So
Good. I don't know. It's bittersweet that you didn't have it, but you had the capacity to give it, so you did that. And I'm sure people do say that. And I hope that tide is shifting, women in different ages now will
Oh,
probably have female
absolutely.
mentors, which is
Yeah.
wonderful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I got to say this in a nice way. And the women who are in those positions now, and I hope they feel comfortable enough in those positions that they feel that they can reach out and be helpful to other women agents.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think when I was coming through, it was at a time where it was self-preservation, not necessarily to reach out to others, to not make yourself look like you're, I'm just like the guys. I'm one
Yeah.
of the guys, and so there was not there there wasn't
You
there
had to
wasn't
fight so hard to get in the room yourself. It's like
right,
you
guys.
couldn't necessarily drag someone up with you. Like
Yes,
it,
exactly.
and that's no
Yeah,
fault of the women's. It's just how it
yeah.
was.
It reminds me of what they talk about with crabs, how crabs can't get out of the boiling pot because as they reach the top, the crab at the bottom is pulling them down
Right.
on their way of trying to get out of the boiling pot. And
Yeah.
so I do recognize that. So that's why I was hesitant to say it. But at the time, that was the reality of it.
Yeah. No, that was the reality. I just interviewed a history podcaster, two of them, and we were talking about the Anita Hill case, and women were
Mm,
really upset with her. And she didn't actually, speaking of the FBI, I think they subpoenaed her. She didn't even come forward with her allegations against Clarence Thomas.
right,
They
right,
asked her to
right.
verify some stories, and women were so furious with her because they're like, we fought so hard to get here, like in these law firms and these high levels of government. And they were mad that she was sort of making an issue, for all of them when you're speaking out against sexual harassment in the workplace. And it was still going on. That was 10 years later.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's tough.
And that's why, when you were able to have mentors from the male agents mentor you, that's why it was so necessary and so needed and so valued. So because when you come into a job where you have so much autonomy and agents really do, they're handling their cases, they're making those decisions. It's not like on TV where there's, a boss that's coming down and telling you every day where to go and what to do.
Yeah.
You, as a brand new agent, you can walk into your office and there's a pile of files waiting for you.
Sure.
But, there are cases assigned to you and you're just told to go work the case. And that's one of the reasons that the average agent that is hired by the FBI is 30 years old. People don't understand that. They're 30 years old. Most of them have come from this is a second career opportunity. They've already worked someplace else. And now they're coming into the FBI and they're 30 and they're given a case and told to go work it.
Wow.
Hit the ground running. And so it's so necessary to have people that are on your squad who know what they're doing, that are going to go out of their way to help you and to provide you with the guidance. There is training. I mean, there's 21 weeks of training at the FBI Academy, but once you get out in the field, and you're assigned something that you may have never worked before in your life, you need people to be able to share their own expertise and experiences and wisdom.
Yeah.
And
Whew.
at that point, you don't really care whether they're female or male.
Yeah. You're like, just please help me.
Yeah, just please help me. Just please
Don't
help
let me drown here alone.
Yeah.
That's great. Jerri, this has been so much fun.
Yes,
Oh,
I've had a great time. I knew I would though, because I listened to your podcast and all the things that you do. So
thank you.
I know you do a great job. And so I was very excited when you
Oh,
invited me to be a part of
that
this.
means a lot, honestly. Coming from you, it really does. But I do have to ask you before you go what I ask all my guests before they go, which is what is keeping you up at night?
Well, I definitely would say that it is the division, in our country. I mean, that is it. It was always there,
Yeah.
but we're all fat, dumb, and happy, and not having to, have it smack us in the face. But, I'm concerned. The people that stormed the Capitol, they're still there. I mean, some of them are sitting in jail, but there's a lot of them that are out there that still feel that same way. And the motivation to start a race war, which is just so outrageous when you think about it, but that is out there. And we've got other countries that are in the middle of that division trying to incite it and to exploit it. And it's absolutely frightening to me, because something's going to happen. Don't know when, don't know where, but if you can have an Oklahoma City bombing, then domestic terrorism. If you can, Dylan Roof, if you can have, the Pulse nightclub, if you can have even the Las Vegas massacre, there are people out there that, whether it's for a race war, for whatever reason, they, anti-government, they're willing to kill and maim. And, hopefully the FBI and all their other federal, state, and local partners can do what they're trying to do now, which is prevent crime, to look at the intelligence and to stop things happening before they happen. But that is a tough job. And unfortunately, something that, that's what keeps me up at night.
Yeah. And it's a tough time for that to coexist with the pressure law enforcement is under because of all the other things you and I were talking about earlier, right? So these are both happening in tandem, and that makes it just all the heavier.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
It's a miracle we ever sleep, really.
Yeah, it is.
Well, I appreciate your time and your creative work that you're pouring into after all your service to our country prior. Just thank you so much for all of it and for being on Dialogue tonight.
Thank you for having me.
Dialogue is a Yellow Tape Media production edited by Jason Usry and produced and hosted by me, Rebecca Sebastian. Please be sure to subscribe to Dialogue, a true crime conversation, wherever you listen to podcasts, and follow us on social media. We are at Dialogue Pod across all platforms. You can also drop me a note or a guest suggestion or sign up for my newsletter at RebeccaSebastian.com. Be sure to join me every Wednesday for a new episode and another killer conversation.